Hello. What is a cluster? And how can Oregon build one in CleanTech? A cluster is a geographical concentration of companies and associations specific to one sector. It can be an outcome of a concentrated effort, economic development effort, to build a cluster. Think of Silicon Valley in the 80s and 90s with Stanford and VCs and technologists and government funding working in concert to create a cluster of technology companies. Or think of Detroit in the 40s. Detroit was synonymous with automobiles and cars. And think of Oregon in the 70s and 80s around semiconductors and shoes and apparel. Oregon has a number of advantages that can position itself to be a clean tech cluster that is globally known. In the ethos of this state, there's a commitment to sustainability that results in ranking first and second in almost every sustainability index around the globe. There's a history, as I mentioned, of culture creation, which I'll spend a little bit more time on in a minute. But we have natural resources here that we all live in this environment because of these natural resources. We want them to last for generations and generations to come. And these natural resources can also be key inputs into figuring out solutions to save our planet. And those are right here in our backyard. There's an ability to attract federal funding, and that is a core ingredient to creating a clean tech cluster. The adjacency to the California and Washington innovation economies means that there's skilled labor nearby. There's passionate people who are founders and want to start companies that can be attracted here to Oregon. The agricultural economy can help with solutions to our food supply issues. And very importantly, there's a history of a culture of innovation here in Oregon. People on the East Coast, when they think of Oregon, they think of the Oregon Trail or Lewis and Clark. But you know, and we know, that there are many more recent examples of innovators here, not just Phil Knight, there are a number of them. So when Intel moved here in 1974 to open its first manufacturing plant, what followed was a number of semiconductor manufacturing companies that came into Oregon. They came here because of the low cost of real estate, the low price of electricity, the access to the Pacific Rim, and eventually a talented workforce as they worked with the university systems to create programs that resulted in those students that were workforce eligible for the semiconductor industry. What resulted was the name Silicon Forest. And so that became the cluster here that is very important economically to the state. Decades later, that cluster is still paying off. It's paying off in big dividends through the CHIPS Act and the commitment that companies, including Analog Devices and others, have made a significant commitment to investment in the state. There's going to be a number of new jobs and new manufacturing plants that will contribute to our security as a country and to the economy of the state. I can tell you Washington State's incredibly jealous of these numbers. This is almost $1.5 billion investment coming into the state in this industry. So that's an example of a very successful cluster that took decades to create and a lot of stakeholders working together to make that a strong part of the Oregon economy. What I want to talk to you about is 5 dimensions that we think about at Moonbeam when we think about cluster creation: incumbents, federal funding, startups, investors, and academia. Each of these play a very important role in creating a cluster. So let's start with incumbents. Yes, big companies were very much a part of creating a lot of the problems of our planet that we're facing today, but they also have to be part of the solution. And it's important to bring them to the table and involve them. They can be a distractor when you think of Tesla and starting and building EVs and the automobile industry pushing against it. But once the automobile industry got on board and created more of a charging infrastructure, things moved faster with adoption of EVs. So that's an example of distraction or really kind of working with the incumbents to accelerate change and innovation. Here in Oregon, we have Nike and Intel and Teledyne and PCC, who all have key sustainability metrics. They're measured now on their emissions. and they are now in search of solutions. Additionally, you have the future incumbents in clean tech here in Oregon. These are growth companies that are off and running in building the clean tech sector here for the state. NewScale works very closely with OSU and gets federal funding. All of these companies on this list are hiring, creating jobs, and they're the future incumbents that are important to engage as you think about tax policies and incentives to attract additional companies in this space into the state. So we all know there are massive amounts of federal funding coming in through the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and as previously mentioned, the CHIPS Act. Federal funding is a really key ingredient for innovation and for startups who are building new ideas. Pre-commercialization, they can take federal funding for non-dilutive infusion of capital into their companies and work on the R&D and help accelerate commercialization and go-to-market efforts. When we look at the research for Oregon and the federal funding coming in here, the Department of Energy, you really are punching above your weight in this area. There's a number of grants coming in, SBIR grants and regular grants into both companies, universities, and cities, and the state, of course. You're getting funding from all the agencies, but particularly in the DOE, where you want to align with your clean tech initiatives. It's one to continue to engage with and look at. These are some specific examples of projects with companies that have applied for the DOE and received DOE grants. One of the suggestions we would make is that as a community and a group of stakeholders, that you really think about what is the narrative for Oregon when you're looking at federal funding and you're applying for these grants. Can you have some consistency and have a kind of cohesive narrative around the advantage of doing business in Oregon and why federal dollars will be utilized here efficiently? That's one of the recommendations we would have in terms of the going forward as you build out a clean tech cluster. We always want more startups in an ecosystem. It's a sign of innovation and excitement, collaboration, new ideas. There's some sector concentration here around energy and business services, and that's great to kind of have a concentration within the cluster. Creating more startups could be a focus area. There's like kind of 4 to 9 started a year. This is not inclusive of companies that are privately held. We don't have access to that data. But these are companies that have done rounds of financing, or in some way or other we have public sources on their establishment. This is a year-over-year look of the number of companies established in the clean tech sector in Oregon. But is this an area that could be a good area to focus on? Like, how do you encourage founders? How do you support founders? I know there are a lot of people here thinking about that. Investors is another key ingredient to creating a successful cluster. When we look at the data here, clean tech investment is fairly small, about $4.5 billion over the last 8 years. Manufacturing, which is a semiconductor, and obviously more capital intensive in some ways than clean tech could be. There's definitely more of a, over 14 billion, fewer companies. There are more deals in clean tech, which is a good indicator that there's activity out there. And those deals represent all sizes of companies, not just the startup community. So those could be all transactions related to clean tech over these years. So we just would recommend thinking about how to get more investment focused in this vertical on clean tech. This slide represents kind of the mix of types of investors in the clean tech sector. You see private equity is significant. That could be from your state funds. There are state funds that you have out of the retirement system, and I know there's a new clean climate fund, that they're both going to be key to acceleration of the clean tech cluster here in Oregon. And so to continue to look at those sources, that gray line in the middle in 2021 represents a corporate venture transactions. That's another kind of reason to think about incumbents and why they're so important. A number of incumbent companies now, corporations now, have what's called corporate venture funds. And these funds, they are really growing in scale quite a lot, and they're being deployed to work towards strategic initiatives that company can have. So if Nike and Intel have a strategic initiatives to address their emissions rate, and they find startups that can help with those solutions, they deploy their corporate venture dollars into those solutions. And so that gray chart represents those corporate venture funds here in Oregon. And that particular year in 21, there was some big transactions. So those are some decent sized numbers. You have about 6 of these that we've discovered over the last few years. I think there could be continuing more. That's part of kind of, the growth area for the CleanTech cluster is to kind of continue to have these companies attract outside capital into Oregon. When you look at the list here of the types of the names of the investors, those would be investors that you could really kind of build relationships with, understand how TPG, what is their investment thesis, what are they looking for, how do you kind of build those relationships so they are part of the ecosystem here and constantly understanding and giving feedback to what they need in order to attract more capital. Last but not least, academia. This is a very important group of people, and R&D that happens in the universities and institutions are critical early commercialization efforts. And it's also really a great opportunity for private sector and industry to work with the academic institutions to really think about what research is needed and what are the problems need to be solved. And when we look across the institutions here in Oregon, the amounts of federal funding coming in specifically designated to clean technology, it's a fairly small proportion of the overall funding coming into the institutions. Institutions, these universities focused on building an R&D clean tech kind of world-renowned research center. And so that could be a path to go down to understand like how to create a clean tech cluster. About 10 years ago, people in Hawaii realized like the dependency on the dirty oil coming into the state was really too high. And when they look across their resources, their natural resources of wind and solar and tidal and geothermal, they really kind of understood they were positioned to have a number of resources to be able to find solutions for our problems in the planet. And so they came together and they, after working through a lot of different meetings and the stakeholders, such as yourself, kind of made this decision that their answer was to create a fund. And so initially they funded just Hawaiian startups, and now it's globally, and they've deployed about over $8 billion in capital, and their portfolio includes about 150 startups. And they're looking at like that Hawaii will be a customer for these solutions that are coming out of these startups. And they really want to wean their dependency off the fossil fuel coming into the state. So I'm going to wrap up here quickly with a call to action to really start small with more startups, but really think big when you think about federal funding and attracting capital and investors into Oregon. Be super curious and really work together. As a stakeholder in this ecosystem, what are you going to do? How are you curious and showing your curiosity about what can result with us all working together? Thank you for your time today.